I have the honor and the joy of welcoming everyone here this evening, welcoming all of you to Earl Hall who are here with us in the Dodge Room, and welcoming those of our audience who are joining us online. And you will understand in a minute when I say we welcome you in the spirit of Earl Hall on Columbia's campus, even though you're not with us in person. And what I mean by that is that by way of introducing tonight's program, I just want to say that this building, Earl Hall, when Morningside campus was built at the turn of the 20th century, was set aside for a specific set of tasks into which tonight's topic falls beautifully. The Dodge family, the building is named for William Earl Dodge, said that in addition to what was at the time the requisite Protestant Christian chapel on the east side of campus, in addition to that building, there should be another space, Earl Hall, set aside for people of all faiths or of no faith, of any tradition, people of good character wanting to build character together. And the building in which we host tonight's event, which is about intercultural connections, interfaith community, is taking place in the space set aside for those very ideals and ideas to be practiced. I think we all agree when we say that our world and our universities need more nuance, more discussion, more connection across points of view and tradition. And so tonight's topic and our speakers who have prepared tonight's event, we welcome you. We're grateful for you joining that heritage and that tradition of this special place. And for those of you who aren't in the room, you are very much here with us in spirit, and we're glad that you've joined us tonight. My name is Ian Rottenberg. I'm Columbia's Dean of Religious Life, and it's a joy to welcome you to tonight's program.
Hello, everybody here in present and online. So this event is a special event because it's the second annual event to commemorate the day of expulsion and departure of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. We started the first one during last year's semester that was during October 7th. And when my professor asked me to speak about the Jews of Yemen or the Jews of the Middle East, I realized that my co-students really didn't know much about it. And November 30th is the day to commemorate the expulsion and the departure. So we created this event called the Indigenousness of the Jewish People to Israel. And that was, again, we didn't have many people in present, but we had many people online. It was a very successful event. And we decided with the university to maybe continue that and create an annual event that when we speak about Jews and on campus, the perception was that Jews are white and thus we really don't have room in the Middle East. So of course, this is just a matter of education. So I felt personally that if I was in this situation, I needed to educate. So we created this event, and when my professor asked me to speak about my family the next time, I decided to just create a film that would be easier to just show and spread around. So we created an event and created a film that I'll give all the credit afterwards. You first have to see the product. So it's about a half an hour presentation, and it follows not just my family, mainly my family, but it's a story of the Jews of Yemen as a representation of the Jews of the Middle East that really never left the Middle East. And that really is the most important thing. And we should feel that we are indigenous in the land and indigenous in the region. So without further ado, our film called From Solomon to Wings of Eagles. So King Solomon is according to a Yemeni tradition, the Jews of Yemen were sent there either as emissaries and maybe as Levites who are as a refuge city or as an embassy, or they were exiled during the first exile of the 10 tribes of the north, the kingdom of Israel, before the destruction of the first temple. So we're talking about 2,500 years at least of documented history of Jews living in Yemen. So from King Solomon to the Wings of Eagles was the operation that brought most of the Jews of Yemen that remained at that point between 1948 and 1951, right after the establishment of the State of Israel. They were airlifted after a very arduous journey through the desert from wherever they were, cascading from the north to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula to Aden, that was still under the British protectorate, and they were flown from there. So let's watch the presentation and have a nice conversation afterwards. Thank you. A lot of work by a lot of people. I don't know how many people are online, but looks like many. So we, before we give credit, of course, to those who worked on this film and this process that started, I would say, a year ago, and really is culminating now. So we will have some presentations now. Please take your seats. Dr. Seth Ward and Dr. Berman-Gladstone, Berman, and I'll be in the middle.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Thank you so much for coming, for coming online. I feel like we're thanking everyone, but it means so much to us. My name is Michelle Simone Miller. I am a host and executive producer of the Mentors on the Mic podcast. I am also a cousin, once removed, of Rabbi Gadi Capela. So this is personal to us. It's a story of our family and our connection to Yemen. And so, this is so important to us as a whole, and just to show that we have always been there. We have always been in the Middle East. And so we have a couple wonderful presentations coming up that we're so excited to share with you. First, Dr. Seth Ward.
Thank you very much. Do you have my things? Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important panel and to offer brief remarks. I've been asked to talk a little bit about Jewish-Muslim relations, and this evening we decided that I should cut up some material that I presented at the Rabbi Gadi synagogue over this past weekend as well. I prepared a little bit of the text, but it's going to be a little bit less formal because I'm going to be looking at the PDFs that I have. The first one has that map. Yes, that's correct. So I hope you can see it. You can see an image that you saw a few moments ago in the film. The very famous, iconic picture that was taken of the migrants through the desert. You'll hear a lot more from Benjamin about them. But it became the monument that celebrates not only Yemenite Jews, but all the communities of the land that came to the land of Israel, or for that matter, were expelled. The usual figure from the Arab lands and from Iran. That's the title that was given about 10 years ago in the Israeli Knesset. What I did when I looked at this map, which you see over there, a little bit different from the map that was in the film, is I took their numbers from 1947, 1948. I added Turkey and one or two other items, and I came up with well over 1 million Jews in the lands of Islam, including Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, is in the map. And today, the number, as you can see on the bottom, I can't see that far. It's, I think, 23,000, something like that. But it's over 1 million difference between then and now. It's quite substantial. Jews and non-Jews lived in harmony in many of these places on a local level. Even when government to government, or I should say government to the Jews, the imam, the sheikh, whatever, there were problems. And I think one of the important takeaways from Gadi's film is how close that relationship could be, yet the Jews very often felt that they were there on borrowed time. Let's advance it a little bit. So one of the issues that I wanted to talk about at the synagogue was the very notion of being indigenous to the Middle East. I have been asked to look into DNA. I'm not really an expert. If there's somebody here who's a population geneticist, they'll probably tell me I'm all wrong. I work a lot with mostly American citizens from the US Southwest who've done genetic studies to show that they may be Spanish speakers, but they have Jewish ancestry. For Ashkenazim, it's very, very clear that Ashkenazim have not only European ancestry, but also Middle Eastern ancestry. Think about that for a moment. Ashkenazim are a community that has largely lived in Europe for somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 years, and in some cases, their ancestors go back even more. And they still have more than half, well, I should say, they have as much or more Middle Eastern heritage, genetically speaking, as European heritage. A very strong argument. That's what those things are there to show you. And interestingly, the Y chromosome studies that are often associated with Jewish men also find that Yemenis, non-Jewish Yemenis, have some of the same genetic background. I think it's very important for that. I spoke about that at the synagogue. Gadi also asked me to speak a little bit about from the river to the sea. Min al-Nahar il-Bahr, Palestine yastahar. If anybody here is an Arabic speaker. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But a lot of people think that Palestine always flows from the river to the sea. And I spent a little bit of time at the synagogue showing that in late Roman times and in Byzantine times and in early Arab times, the river was not the boundary of Palestine ever. This is a modern, you're going to hear from Benjamin how you can blame the British for all sorts of things. You can blame Winston Churchill for the river to the sea. No one earlier than that. Traditionally it was green crayon. He said, this is where the border is going to be. I don't know if you know the story, but something like that. Yeah. The national home in Palestine, not an independent state, was going to be only from the river to the sea. That is, I can't think of anybody who's more colonial than the first secretary of colonization, Winston Churchill. Okay, let's go on a little bit. I don't know whether you can see the next one. Can you blow up? No, let's look at this anyway. I'll read what I have there. It's a copy of the.
Can they see that online? Okay.
Yeah. It's what I have is a copy of the Pact of Omar, which I'll talk about in a moment. Benjamin will be able. No, go back to the thing.
I'm just making sure they can see it.
Oh, good. Benjamin will be able to tell us what the thing on the left is. I took this week's parasha, this week's Torah reading, and it has the Arabic as well as the Aramaic and the Hebrew from the beginning of the parasha. And I put a copy of an autograph of Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. You can see his signature there at the very bottom of the one on the left. Moses ben Maimon has a very special place, at least in the historiography of the Jews of Yemen. In the 1100s, for the most part, things were okay in Yemen, but at two different junctures, there were messianic movements and there was trouble with the leaders of Yemen. Maimonides wrote something called the Epistle to Yemen. Igeret Teman is what it's always called in Hebrew. in which he argued to them, you don't convert and you shouldn't commit suicide. You shouldn't do all those terrible things. You should strive to remain Jews. And he was credited with having saved the Jewish community. And again, historiography typically says that Maimonides intervened with the Ayyubid rulers. Ayyubids were the dynasty of Saladin, the famous Saladin. And Maimonides was working in the court of the Ayyubids in Cairo, intervened with them to prevent further persecution of the Jews in Yemen. I looked for a copy of the famous Kaddish, which was supposed to say, B'chayechon of Yomechon of Chaye, the Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. I don't know whether it ever existed, but the reference is to Ramban, it's to Nachmanides, who said that it did, for whatever it's worth. Let me talk about the status of the Jews of Yemen. The thing that's probably too small for you to see is something called the Pact of Omar. The Pact of Omar is based on the generals of the second caliph of the the Islamic Caliphate, not the first successor of Muhammad, but the second one. His generals came to places, they had conquered Christians, Jews, a group called Magians, who are usually understood as Zoroastrians, and they wrote him, obviously forced to do so. We agree that we're not going to harbor spies, we're not going to rebel against you, we're going to offer your armies food for 3 days, we're going to offer you a place in the southern part of our churches for you to have prayers, and so on and so forth. Over time, lots of persecuting laws were added. Some, for example, some sultans and caliphs said, we're not going to wear shoes the same color, or we're not going to let them ride on horses, or we're not going to let them build new synagogues and churches, and so on and so forth. By the 10th century and the 11th century, this had become something called the Pact of Omar, which has all those regulations, including not riding on donkeys, not using Arabic names, not using Arabic seals, and so on and so forth. This is the Pact of Omar, which was typically promoted by the 1300s or so to rule the Christian and Muslim communities. Why don't you go to the next slide that I have? Gadi should have sent you 2 handouts.
Oh, the next video.
Yeah. Now, while he's loading this, I'm going to mention that one of the sources of problems in Yemen was a Shia group. This group is the Zaydis. Told the largely Ashkenazi community, the Zaydis have nothing to do with grandparents. Some of you will know what I'm talking about. They had to do with Zayd, who was the great-great-grandson of Muhammad and was the 5th in line, according to the Zaydis, to be an imam. The Shias in Iran are 12ers. They believe there were 12 divinely inspired leaders, and the last one died in the 9th century, or I'm sorry, disappeared in the 9th century, and will come back at the end of time to reinstate grandeur. There's Zayd rebelled against the Umayyad Empire, and there were 2 Zaydi states, one of them around the Caspian Sea, but the more important one for our purposes was in Yemen. The Houthis, for example, are Zaydis. The imams that persecuted the Jews, for the most part, were Zaydis. The Ottomans, they really were fairly okay to the Jews when they in the 19th and early 20th century. But the Zaydis, when they came back, persecuted the Jews, and they had the orphan decree, for example. So the Zaydis really are an important part of that. We're going to go on. Can you bring that down a little bit more? I don't know whether you can. This is still the first PDF. Did you get a second PDF? I designed these as a handout for the synagogue because I was speaking on the Sabbath and I didn't want to use a PowerPoint. And I didn't realize that kindly they would allocate me a few more moments. Why don't you go down just a little bit? Let's see if you can see it here. Yeah. So no, it's not going to be large enough, and I put some text about the antiquity of the Yemenite Jewish community. I'm just going to lecture it. You'll have to excuse me. Kul walad yulad Allah fitra. You could understand my Arabic. It's good for
Yeah.
Kul waladu yulad Allah fitra wa abawahi yuhawidanihi wa yunassiranuhu wa yumajjisanuhu. Every child is born on the natural religion, but his parents make him Jewish or Christian or a Magian. This was the justification in the Hadith. This was supposedly pronounced by Muhammad, and it's found in the two most important collections of Hadith. This was the justification for the orphan's decree. The orphan's decree said, if you don't have a father, and of course, the language in Arabic is in the dual, have to have two parents. If you don't have a father, then you cannot be part of the Pact of Umar, according to the legalistic thinking. That's the justification for the orphan's decree that you heard about. The organizers of the film asked me to put a little bit of perspective into this, and I'm going to stop with just a brief moment. I already told you, and you saw the numbers, I think you could see it in the PowerPoint, over 1 million Jews in 1948, only 20 some odd, 30 some odd thousand Jews in all of those countries outside of Israel, from Morocco to Pakistan today. In general, up to 1948, things were okay in a number of communities, but the Turkish Republic, like the Ottomans before them, persecuted Christians, threw them out, killed many, and had rules that made it nuts, despite the fact that the Turkish government wants people to think that they were good for people trying to escape from the Nazis. They weren't that good. And they had a wealth tax, which impoverished the Jews of Turkey. And in more recent times, in the past 5 years, lots of Turkish Jews are fleeing Erdogan. In the late kingdom period in Egypt, Jews were integrated into Egypt, as were Armenians and all the other religious minorities. The officers, the young officers, Gamal Abdel Nasser and his friends took power in 1952. That changed things radically. By 1956, the Egyptian Jews, some of you may have seen Sacha Baron Cohen's film about the spy. He was an Egyptian Zionist in the 1950s. You could be that. But in 1956, they lost their citizenship, and most of them left to all sorts of places. Today, there may not even be 10 Jews left. There's a group of 10 from Yemen who were exiled to Cairo and are stuck there, from what I understand. Baghdad, you have the same thing. The Baghdadi Jews went all over the world. I asked Gadi's congregation if anybody had ever gone to a Peninsula Hotel. Peninsula Hotel is Jewish money from Baghdad, and all over the Asian world, including in New York and various other places outside the Asian world. Nazi propaganda in the 1940s was de rigueur. The monarchy that was Hashemite wasn't so bad, but when they were toppled in the 1930s, then the Nazis came in. The Nazis had propaganda, and there was a Farhud, there was a pogrom against the Jews of Baghdad in 1941. In the land of Israel, the Mufti was killing Jews and calling for the murder of Jews before Hitler was, for whatever that's worth. I like to tell people Hitler did not need the Mufti of Jerusalem to tell him to eliminate Jews, but he was there first. I think my time is more than up. Thank you for allowing me a few more minutes than I had planned, and I'll be happy to discuss any of this stuff more in our question and answer period.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. There will be time for questions after all the presentations, but thank you, Dr. Seth Ward. And just to give you a brief understanding of his background, he's the Director Emeritus at the University of Denver's Institute for Islamic-Judaic Studies. So perfect for this. So thank you so much. And we're also going to hear from Rabbi Gadi Capela. You know him from the film. He also introduced the whole program. He got his master's here, as he said earlier in the film, in modern Jewish studies. And he's also the co-founder, he hasn't mentioned this yet, the co-founder of Project Genesis Interfaith. And so he's going to talk a little bit about the eternal nexus of Yemeni Jews and the land of Israel.
Yeah. Okay, I hope you can hear me. Okay. Online, I hope you can hear me online. So for me, the idea of the connection of the Jews of Yemen, the continuous connection was very important because when we say that we're indigenous to the region or Middle Eastern Jews, still that doesn't mean that we're specifically are from the land of Israel. So I wanted to present to you give you some information based on Professor Gimani, actually Aaron Gimani from Bar-Ilan University, that shows the connection, direct connection over the centuries of Yemeni Jews to the land of Israel. So a well-known Yemenite legend attributes the origin of the Jewish exile to Yemen to the time when the first temple still stood, when it was still the center of Jewish life. Rabbi Shlomo Adani, a Yemenite exile who immigrated to the land of Israel in the 16th century, wrote about the tradition upheld by Yemenite Jews regarding their arrival to the land of Israel from Yemen. And in his introduction to the Mishnah, called Melechet Shlomo, he writes that Jews arrived during the first temple. And he writes, "From my father's house, it has been handed down that we came here during the first exile." And the first exile is the exile of the 10, what we call 10 lost tribes of the kingdom of Judea and what we call today Judea and Samaria, were the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel. So when the Assyrians exiled those 10 tribes that they're lost to us now, but 160 years before the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, in Judea, he writes that there's a quote from the Book of Kings, and he says, "They exiled them to Hala, Habor, and the river of Gazon, and the cities of Mediz." Also applies to us. That's the tradition that was handed down. The verse he cited refers to the exile of the 10 tribes, and this is significant because it ties the Yemenite Jews to the land of Israel specifically. There are certain, as a rabbi for me, I'm interested in the halakha and the custom of what Yemeni Jews have been holding. And just a funny story, Yemeni Jews have Baladi and Shami. Baladi means balad in Arabic, means the land. So it's the custom of the land that they settled in, meaning the land of Yemen. The Shami meant the land of Israel. So there are two traditions, especially after the connection of the Yemeni Jews with Maimonides, who really kind of brought them along. So a Yemenite synagogue has these two traditions. And when I was growing up, I only used to go to a Yemenite synagogue. I didn't know from an Ashkenazi synagogue. And always in the middle of the service, there was an argument. They started arguing. And I thought it was part of the service until I came to New York and I went to Ashkenazi synagogues and there were no arguments. So I asked my father, "What is it about?" I really thought, so he said, "No, because there was a certain point in the reading and the prayer and the liturgy that there was an argument whose Shabbat it is now." They divided the Shabbatot to Shami and Baladi. So it was a funny story. So, but the Yemeni Jews are very strict in their observance. For example, they're different and this is what the researchers showed, that our customs actually go back to ancient times. So it's not just beautiful melodies, but actually the original melodies. So I'll give you an example. Our pronunciation is very different. So whether you understand Hebrew or not, but the most common phrase in the Torah is "Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemo," when God spoke to Moses saying. So in Yemeni pronunciation would be "Vaydaber Adonai al Moshe lemer." So it sounds totally different. But really, this is the pronunciation that we've held from ancient times. We are the only community that holds on to the translation of the Torah. When we read the Torah, we read it one verse at a time, and we translate it into Aramaic. That used to be the vernacular. So the halakha, the law, is that you have to read the text twice and then translate it to people who don't understand Hebrew. So we still have that in our synagogue growing up. Even children have regular approaching the Torah and aliyah, coming up to the bima to bless the Torah and reading the Torah. And if you make any mistake, you are in grave danger. So this is just to show you how pious and how observant they were. So it says that more explicit testimony comes from Rabbi Yechia Tzalach, that is known for his 18th century scholarship. And he is, in his writing, he gave a voice to many aspects of spiritual heritage of Yemenite Jews. In one source, he recorded a tradition among Yemenite Jews that their prayer customs date back to the era of the first temple. And he writes, "It is well established among us, and all the customs regarding prayer stem from the time of the destruction of the first temple." These statements from Yemenite sages indicate that the ancient Torah tradition of the land of Israel reached Yemen with the exile who arrived there. There are several prominent features, and I'm going to go through the three features that directly connect us to the land of Israel in antiquity. And the first one is the tefillin, the phylacteries that we put on the forehead and wrap around our arm. And it says in Hilchot Tefillin, the rules of Tefillin, Maimonides, instruct that tefillin are to be sewn as using sinews from the heel of kosher animals or beasts. However, Yemenite Jews traditionally sew their tefillin using, it's called gidei hakesalim. It's sinews from the thigh muscles located near the kidney, rather than those from the heel. I know for many people, I'm now speaking Chinese, but for some people, this is the most important thing in their observance. Another rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Kafach, who is the has been the leading, he passed away, leading Yemenite rabbi in the 20th century, he found support to this ancient Yemenite tradition in archaeological findings from Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And he saw the tefillin of the head were discovered sewn with non-twisted sinews. So it basically showed that this was the custom of our forefathers from ancient times in the land of Israel during the first and second temple period, to sew tefillin with these sinews. So just like the Yemenite custom. I actually have, if you can show the PowerPoint and how it looks, it's very interesting. The tefillin of the head has 4 compartments. And so So here, yes, that one, yeah, if you can show that bigger. It was open, so keep going to the next slide. It's a beautiful slide, but it doesn't say a lot. The next, can you see the next slide? Okay, I'll just continue, I guess. So this is a big deal. This goes to, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves that were found, really prove the authenticity of Jews, period, in the land 2 centuries before, before the Common Era. So you see that they're wrapped around with these sinews. The second one is very interesting, is the priestly division chart. And that the idea that those who went to Yemen, you can show the next one with the stone on it. Not this one. This is from Qumran. Keep going. So what it is, it's the priests that were exiled, this one, and this is incredible. This was basically the timesheet of Kohanim, the priests in the temple. And this was found near Sana'a, near the capital city of Yemen, which was found in a mosque in the village of Beit al-Khatzor, near Sana'a. So this is a stone that was found with Hebrew inscription listing some of the priestly divisions. The stone was discovered and photographed in 1970 by Dr. Walter Mueller, a member of the German archaeological expedition to Yemen. Similar discoveries were made in 3 locations in Israel. So that it connects them directly in Ashkelon, Caesarea, and near Kisufin in the Negev. And the third one is, of course, our piyutim, the way we sing. And what it says in Beit She'arim, I'll get to the piyutim, but maybe I'll skip it because this is another very important connection. When Jacob died, our forefather Jacob died in Egypt, he asked his children, the tribes, to bury him in Israel. And apparently the Yemeni Jews have done the same thing. Not everybody, of course, you had to have means. So those who could did. And it says in Beit She'arim, another piece of evidence comes from its excavations. It was a Jewish city in the southern Galilee. This city was renowned in the first century for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He was the author, the compiler of the Mishnah, the first oral tradition. And this, and it says, with excavation, a hall containing burial caves of Jews from Yemen was discovered. And that means that highlighting a strong cultural and spiritual connection to the land. I will just end with this, with the idea of the melodies. There is definitely evidence of physical connections existing from the Himyarite period of Yemen during the first centuries following the destruction of the Second Temple. And the melodies, I'll just conclude with that, in the 19th century, Rabbi Yaakov Sapir, during his visit to Yemen, was deeply impressed by the melodic traditions of Yemeni Jews. He marveled at the abundance of melodies tailored to different forms of study. Torah, prophets, writing, Targum, it's the translation I was talking about, and to Arabic, Halakha, Agadah, and more. Just I'll end with that quote. It says, all are proficient in reciting the Torah with its intonation and melodies, adhering strictly to proper pronunciation. Likewise, the Haftarah, the portion from the writings, is recited, or the prophets, is recited with a pleasant and beautiful melody They are meticulous in their reading, whether a scripture, Targum, or to Torah study of the books, down to every accent and nuance in the melodies that have been ours since ancient times. Thank you.
So interesting. You know, specifically, and I think we've talked about this from what I've heard too, and this is very much aligned with what Gadi was just saying, is that a lot of the traditions of the Yemenis culture for Jews is very aligned with the traditions from, you know, long ago from ancient Israel. So, you know, it's nice to see a lot of those moments of connection there. One more presentation. Please think of your questions online, you guys too, and as well as you here, because we're going to have some time for questions. So our remaining presentation is from Dr. Benjamin Berman-Gladstone, who you might remember from the film, and he's a postdoctoral fellow at IIJS Columbia. And specifically, he's going to focus on the plunder of Yemeni Jews on the road to Aden, anarchy, hatred, or British colonial policy. So looking forward to it.
Thank you. Can we pull that up, please? And make sure to share it? Yeah, thanks so much. Okay, so thank you very much for being here in person and online, and thank you, Rabbi Capela, for organizing. It's been a pleasure to learn from you all and from the film as well. So a common feature, as you heard in the film, of Yemeni Jewish migration stories is robbery, plunder. As Jewish refugees made their way to Aden, which is a British crown colony, and they had to get there before they could fly to Israel, they were often attacked, sometimes physically harmed, and deprived of their property, sometimes literally stripped of their property, of their clothes as well, and often their whole life savings. So this is a process that is known about in the scholarship, but the original contribution that I'm going to be making today is in trying to better understand that process of plunder and how the Jews of Yemen lost or denuded of all of their property, of all their movable property, as they made their way to Aden. Moshe Gavra, based on memoirs like that of Rabbi Shalom Mansoura and oral histories, writes that most of these robberies happened not in Yemen proper, where the decree of the Imam Ahmed, at least in theory, held in check those who otherwise might have carried out robberies or molested Jews, but rather in the sultanates of what he calls southern Yemen. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. These regions are a series of a web of sultanates that comprise the Aden protectorates. So you see at the bottom there, that white circle, that's the Aden colony that was directly ruled by a British governor and by English colonial officials. And then the pink region there is Yemen. This whole thing is Yemen now, but the pink region there is what was Yemen at the time. And those green regions, the Western and Eastern Aden protectorates, were ruled by sultanates, which were not just backed by the British, but the strings were really pulled by the British, their British territory. So from the perspective of the migrants themselves and of scholarship based on their experiences and testimonies, the contrast between Yemen proper, that pink region, and the green region suggests one of two things. Either that those sultanates were anarchic, is a word that's often used, as in they weren't really directly ruled in any serious way at all, or that the residents of those territories bore some special hatred for the Jews. The relatively peaceful passage, I say relatively peaceful passage, through many parts of northern Yemen, reinforces in public memory the idea that there were historically good relations in Yemen, which sometimes there were and sometimes there weren't. But at the same time, the impression that we might come away with is that in this region called South Yemen, there was some kind of indelible hatred. There was something fundamentally different in Jewish-Muslim relations, Jewish-Arab relations. What I want to argue today is that the difference in refugee experience between Yemen proper and the Aden protectorates was actually a result of British policymaking. The British did exercise control over the protectorates, and particularly strict control over the roads. These often violent encounters between Muslim robbers and Jewish refugees then should be understood I'm arguing not as a direct result of deep-seated animosities, but as the product of a rather typical colonial policy of pitting ethnic and religious groups under colonial domination against one another, what we often refer to as divide and rule. So I'm going to present two letters to you, and I'm going to kind of skim through them a little bit because we don't have so much time, that give us a sense of, or that are part of my argument for how we should understand this as a British colonial policy. One of these letters is the impression of an employee of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which managed and often mismanaged a lot of this migration from Yemen to Israel. And the other one is a British intelligence report. But let's get to that first document. If you don't mind moving through to the first block quote slide, please. Thank you very much. This is a letter from Joseph Simon, who is working for the Joint Distribution Committee, to his boss, Harry Vitalis, in July of 1949, which is a couple months after the officially authorized migration that we now know as On Eagle's Wings began. He writes about the Fudli Sultan, which is one of those green regions in the Western Aden Protectorate. Obstructing is the word that he uses. A British agent known as Allen went to Shukra, which is the capital of the Fudli Sultanate, and negotiated ostensibly on the Jews' behalf for a couple of days there. And in practice, the result was that the Fudli Sultan held the first load came down from Lodar to Shukra. He held the people. So there's some kind of detention, some kind of actually hostage situation going on, probably to extort bribes to get money out of the Jewish community. Allen told Simon, right, this British officer told this American Jewish official that that it was the Fudli Sultan's decision and couldn't be helped. But he later sort of admitted, and so did this other British official, Gopal, that they really could have forced the Fudli Sultan's hand, and they basically just weren't willing to do it. The Fudli Sultan is one of the sultans controlling, again, one of those territories, actually a major territory under British control, and is interposed between many of the Jews' former homes in Yemen, in that pink region, and the Aden colony. So I'm going to argue soon that I think that Simon's suspicion that the British were kind of giving him the runaround and weren't really on his side was well-founded. But first, we're going to get to one more source from the intelligence report. If you go to the next slide, please. This is from September 1949, written by Richard Percy Errington, who was the British Chief Secretary for the Protectorate. In the Western Aden Protectorate, where for valid reasons, he writes, including the safety of the Jews themselves, the Aden government has declined to intervene in the conditions under which they are permitted to pass. A tax at a fixed tariff per head is collected at every tribal frontier, while brutal tribesmen pick over their poor belongings, discussing perhaps whether a pregnant woman should be charged double or whether the party should be delayed until she has given birth. Errington, this man, was actually the person most directly responsible for managing British domination of the Protectorate at that time. And I want to draw your attention to the words that he uses. He doesn't use the word rob or plunder, but the word tax and tariff, suggesting basically that although he finds this process distasteful, there's some kind of legitimacy to it. He even notes that the Aden government, which when he uses that word, he's referring to the British regime ruling the Aden colony, had basically chosen not to intervene in these cases. So the things that we were hearing in the video as roadblocks, right? These acts of robbery, which were experienced by the Jews crossing through as robberies and plunder, very often, from the British perspective, were actually legitimate or semi-legitimate extraction of taxes as they passed through. Errington presents this choice basically as one of non-intervention. These tribesmen are doing the looting from a Jewish perspective, or the taxing from a British perspective, and the British have just decided basically that it's none of their business. But we have to understand this policy in the larger context of British policy in the Aden Protectorates. In my research, I've found that not only were the British the people controlling and securing the roads that led through the Aden Protectorates to the colony, but they were also actually very punctilious about what went on along those roads. The entire British security apparatus, in fact, actually, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And through the text on that slide, and you'll have to click through a few times. Thank you. Sorry about that. The entire British security apparatus, in fact, was built around those very roads. In 1934, the British regime and the Yemeni imamate signed a deal, the Treaty of Sana'a, which somewhat, not entirely, stabilized the relationship between the two entities. And from that point on, the then resident of Aden, Bernard Riley, who later managed colonial policy from the Colonial Office, advocated a system of colonial militias and road guards, which became the centerpieces of the British security policy in the protectorates. The roads were really crucial for two reasons. First of all, they conveyed goods produced in the protectorates and sometimes in Yemen to the port in the Aden colony, both for trade purposes and to supply British troops. So they were essential basically for the economic colonization of Aden. And they were also the means by which English officers and colonial militiamen could penetrate deep into the protectorate territories, imposing British martial power. So the British often enforced their road policy, for example, through aerial bombardments. That's what you're seeing here. This is an Air Force jet over Aden. They fought long campaigns against Mansouri guerrillas over the issue of banditry and unauthorized taxation on the roads throughout the 1930s. And then in the 1940s, they flattened Qutaybi villages and even contemplated a plan of massacring civilians in their fields over the same issue, banditry and unauthorized taxation along the roads. It appears that it was actually common knowledge among the peoples of the protectorates that the British were especially sensitive to road security. In 1937, for example, the Sha'iri community, which had been struggling for years to win its independence from Dala'a, which is a provincial capital, took advantage of the disrepair of the Khurayba Pass between Dala'a and Aden, one of these roads, to take a stand, informing the British political officer Hamilton of their intention to forcibly prevent the road's repair. That incident, that protest, sparked a wave of protests and repression that the British called the Sha'iri War. In the same year, but in the Eastern Protectorate, and the Eastern Protectorate is also relevant because Jews were not just coming from Yemen proper, they were also coming from the Hadramaut in the East. We talk about Habani Jews as a distinctive community that was out in the East, in the Eastern Protectorate. But in the Eastern Protectorate, an enslaved man by the name of Sarur Simone rebelled against his masters, who were apparently starving him, by targeting a trade route. He held up a camel and stole the goods associated with it. William Harold Ingrams, who was in charge of establishing the British foothold in the Hadramaut, wrote that he had done so in order to bring trouble on his masters. So we can't know for sure what Sarur Simone actually had in mind. It's very difficult for us to get at the perspectives of enslaved people because they're very little documented. But we do know that at the very least, Ingrams expected that the people of the protectorates, and not just the elites, but even enslaved people, would be aware that the British would intervene specifically in response to roadside robberies. That was the issue that they were invested in. Now I want to go back to the example of the Fadli Sultan, who according to Simon was obstructing Jewish passage through his territory. Recall that in Simon's assessment, based on what he heard from the British officials, the British could have forced a change in policy, but had chosen not to. A look at the archival record really bears this out. The relevant sultan would have been Abdullah bin Uthman, who in 1941 actually delivered the surrender to British forces of his predecessor, Saleh bin Abdullah. The last Fadli Sultan had been deposed after several incidents, but the final straw was his levying of road tolls in excess of those permitted by the British regime, and in one instance, momentarily detaining a group of government guards, Arab militiamen under British direction, in order to extract taxes from them. So Abdullah bin Uthman certainly knew that the British were willing to depose their erstwhile allies, and moreover, knew that the road and taxation issues were the major issues that would trigger a harsh British response if the regime was so inclined. So the British behaved very differently toward the robbery and taxation of Jewish refugees than they did to other robberies and unauthorized road tolls specifically, and threats to road security in general. This is of a piece with the rest of British policy toward the Jewish migrants. Can we go through the text of the next? It's maybe 2 slides, I think. Yeah, can we get the text of that too, please? Thank you. The British also, on multiple occasions, attempted to close borders along the way, and sometimes succeeded, with catastrophic results for the refugees stranded without supplies and vulnerable to marauders. Earlier in 1949, they also demolished buildings in the Aden refugee camp, specifically in order to make it harder for refugees to come. And they made it difficult for Yemeni Jews to work in Aden. So we heard in the video about the horrible conditions in the Aden refugee camp. Part of the reason for that is because the British at times deliberately disconnected the water and in other ways made it intentionally difficult to live there. That was a policy choice. Moreover, it was a regular part of British policy to, rather than directly enacting policies that so flagrantly violated the humanitarian principles that they claimed to uphold, do so through the peoples, and especially the sultans of the protectorates. So I've given another example here, that although the British colonial officials made a regular habit of kidnapping civilians, including children, as hostages to keep the communities under control, Riley, the British official we met earlier, wrote that he would prefer those hostages not to be under the direct control of the British. Instead, they were held at sites in the protectorate. The sultanates served as legal black holes that could protect the British from liability for such policies, so that they would also try to hamper Jewish migration by allowing attacks in those territories, right? It's actually the same kind of policy decision that the British were using to enact other policies that they wanted to distance themselves from in their colonial domination of the protectorates. So, in other words, this is actually very recognizable, this process, as a process of colonial control and violence against migrants. I want to, can we go through the text of the next slide too, please? Thank you. I'm way over time here, I'm sure, so I'm just gonna Okay. At the very least, I want to nod to these 2 points, to the significance of these findings, I think, and we can talk about them more in Q&A if it's of interest. The first point here is that I think it's important that we understand the divide and rule colonial context of the various Middle East conflicts. We think about Jewish-Arab relations sometimes in sort of a vacuum, and especially we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as somehow special or unique, different from others a lot of the time. And in fact, a closer look often points us to the same sorts of policies that we see in India and parts of Africa, really all over the world, where the British and other colonial powers rule. They have all kinds of incentives and interests in pitting communities against each other in order to make them easier to manage. So sometimes intercommunal violence is difficult and they have to try to control it. It gets out of hand. And at other times it's useful to them and they sort of play this game. This is certainly what happened it's definitely what happened in Aden in 1947, when there was a major outbreak of violence. And this is another focus of my research that we didn't get to talk about so much today, where actually the colonial militiamen in British uniform did most of the murder, actually, of Jews in Aden and the destruction of the Jewish community there. And we see sort of parallels to that all over the region. And we can also see it in, for example, Amir's finding that British agents goaded the Arab states into attacking Israel in 1948, the sort of rapid expansion of the conflict from one that was not entirely, but mostly local, to one that had this regional dimension, happened at the behest of British intelligence officers. So we kind of see this over and over again. And I think that this is sort of one piece in the puzzle that helps us understand how figures like Eliyahu Sassoon could be part of both Arab nationalist and Zionist clubs in Damascus, but later that was totally impossible and inconceivable. This process is in large part a colonial history. The other piece that, again, we can talk about if it's of interest, is that I think that this study has important implications for contemporary migration studies. When we're talking about the policies that the British colonial officials adopted against Jewish migrants, which also in some cases, and we didn't have a chance to talk about that here, they developed initially against East African migrants and then applied against Jewish migrants. But when we start to understand this sort of the history of the development of colonial borders and the techniques they used, we actually might see a lot of parallels to the current day. And I'm thinking specifically of the southern border of the United States, which this is a picture from, and the sort of bureaucratic and political apparatus, things like the ironically named migrant protection protocols that deliberately extend the border, utilize deserts and the deaths that they cause, and utilize banditry and other kinds of things to make the migration process dangerous and difficult as de facto part of the border regime that the state employs. So I think that it's worth noting that tactics used in the US today really parallel British colonial tactics in Aden in the 1940s. So those are two very different directions of potential implications for this study. But I think that I think they're both worth thinking about. And in the Q&A, we can talk about whatever folks here are interested in talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berman-Gladstone. So does anyone have any questions that we can ask our wonderful panel here off the top of your head? I gave you fair warning that we were going to have this part. And I have a couple of questions myself, but both online and in person, if anyone has any questions, we'd love to answer them. Oh, okay. Well, if anything comes up, please let us know. Yeah, oh, my, this is my husband, guys.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I have a question for you. During your presentation, you showed some Arabic countries. Oh, there we go. With very small populations, like 10 Jews in Iraq or something. Is that a precise number? And is that one family? How does that, seems like a very specific number, 10 as opposed to 5 or 15. Who are they?
Earlier, Benjamin told me he was in Jordan and learned a little bit of Jordanian slang. The Jordanians would say Allah Barif. God knows. This was a found object. It was associated with, I found it in the Jewish Virtual Library, and they gave credit to a unit, which I don't know how research-based it is. But Iraq is a good example. In 1969, there were enough Jews so that there were about 15 people who were hanged by Saddam Hussein, and everybody's related to everybody. So I'd never met an Iraqi who didn't say, oh yeah, that was my cousin. Just like
repeat the question. I don't know if they heard it online. The question.
Okay. Oh.
What was can you, Michelle, maybe with your,
well, he had a microphone.
or
Right.
you can
Is that
repeat the
better?
question?
The question was, how reliable are the numbers when they say there were 10 Jews in such and such a place?
And do we know who they are? Who are they? Is this
And who they are.
individuals?
So I have a colleague who lived in Iraq and met Iraqi Jews, and he thinks there's basically one Jew in Iraq as opposed to 10. Now that means it's only 10% of the number, but that's not a big difference in actual numbers. I read recently some reports about Gadi and Michelle's cousin, who apparently went back to Iraq or went to Iraq. I don't know whether he was born in Iraq.
To Yemen.
Went to Yemen to rescue Torah scrolls, was imprisoned by the Yemeni government.
Still, he's considered the last Yemeni.
He's the only
And
one
he's
there.
now, his name, Rabbi Merhavi, which is my mother's maiden name. So he's her cousin.
So one of the reports said that there were 13 Jews that were rounded up and they were sent to Cairo, and they're not able to go to the land of Israel any place other than that. That will increase the number of Jews in Cairo, because the news report says that there were like 5 or 6 old women, widows, who are the only people left in Cairo. I don't really know, but there are probably more Israelis in Cairo today than there are Cairo Jews. Turkey has a large Jewish community, but they're fleeing. Iran probably has the largest Jewish community of any of those places, and we know something about the numbers. But again, it's a fraction of what they had before. Morocco has, I forget what the number is on the map, but there are vibrant Jewish communities in Casablanca and a few other places, but a fraction of what there was in 1948. And Jews are not going back to Morocco. I have a little bit of a story about indigenous Jews. When I was living in Haifa, I had a friend who became active in what now is called the Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. And I remember telling her, people are talking about Jews who are not indigenous to the region. You have Jews who came from Egypt and North Africa and Iraq, then why not promote this story? And at that time, she said, we're not ready to do this because Saddam Hussein was still alive, and the military government of Egypt and the king of Morocco would all say, tafaddalu, come back to our countries. And none of the Israelis were going to go back to those countries. As much as like Gadi's father, they remembered beautifully how wonderful it was. Casablanca, you have Yehoram Gaon sing about how he remembers how wonderful Shabbat was in Morocco. None of them are going back, really. And that's also part of it. Long answer to a short question. The numbers are no one really knows.
I have a question, actually. I think it's a looming question of all the subject. Why do you think, I'm going to ask you both scholars, why do you think that this history of Jews from the Middle East is not as in the forefront as the history of European Jews? I may be touching a sensitive point here, but that really is why we're here.
Have answers for you.
Yeah, sure, I can give my answer.
Yeah.
I think that there are two factors that we need to account for. One of them is that history in general has a Eurocentrism problem. And when almost any history that we're talking about is going to have that kind of issue. And the academy is slowly, I want to say slowly but surely, but slowly waking up to the importance of including, at least in part, if not in equal measure, not just the Middle East and North Africa, but all parts of the world, all communities and that kind of thing. And that's a process that we're collectively working on. But the other component that is more specific to this is that it's politically inconvenient for a lot of people to acknowledge that the majority of Israeli Jews don't fit a rubric that they want them to fit. And so I think that as long as the very existence of Middle Eastern and North African Jews today and those histories in the region are an inconvenience for a very powerful pseudo-historical narrative and its advocates, those people will continue to be erased, both in the history books and, if they have their way, in the real world.
So are we should take part of the blame internally as the Jewish people for not promoting those stories?
I think yes.
I am very, very happy with Benjamin's response. I'm of a different generation, and white hair was earned over many years of aggravation. I grew up being fascinated by this material. I studied Judeo-Arabic, and we had a whole area. I studied Judeo-Arabic, among other things, at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Professor Zucker was taken off Judeo-Arabic doing literary texts to teach Talmud because they needed Talmud more than they needed Judeo-Arabic. Depending on which scholar you read, 200 or 300 years ago, there were double the number of Jews in the Ottoman Empire as there were in Poland. That changed in the 19th century. In the 18th century, there were probably double the number of Sfaradim, if not more than that, in the United States. That changed probably already in late colonial times, but certainly in the 19th century, that changed dramatically. So Gadi, a Yemeni Jew who probably never heard the word shul or half a dozen other Yiddish words, never heard the word dreidel. Dreidel is a good example. I know many Sfaradim who talk about playing with dreidlach. They don't use the Yiddish term, but that's what they talk about, as if this is part and parcel of the Jewish tradition, without realizing that Chaim Nachman Bialik did not know about a sivivon. Avi Natan, we say sivivon li. My father gave me a sivivon, but that's not what he wrote originally. This had to be a created word in Hebrew because it didn't exist in Hebrew. That's why they call it a dreidel. That's why they call it shul. And part of it has to do with the fact that the American Jewish community is overwhelmingly Ashkenazi in its background. People are interested in their own, Jews are most interested in their own roots. I wish we could have the Arabs interested in Jewish roots. Maybe it will happen. I had a hard time at the University of Denver with that. I had a couple of Arab students who were interested, but that's also part of it. When I was a kid, what did I read? I read Ashtora about the Jews of Spain and about the Jews of the Middle East. And I read all the histories of the Jews of Egypt and the land of Israel. I studied Geniza. That stuff was all out there. I think that there is a sense that the Sephardic and Edom HaMizrach community in the land of Israel doesn't fit the pattern, but we learned all about them. Here's my point, after I go, speaking off the cuff for much too long. There are lots of things in life that we know better about, but that doesn't stop us from still having our own preconceived notions as to what's important. And we need to know more about this story. And there is a change that's about. I did this many years ago, but I hope there are more stories. I talked about the jizya. This is fight with the people of the book until they pay the jizya out of hand, being humble. That's from the Quran, chapter 9. And this humbling is the Quranic background for the Pact of Umar I spoke about. I didn't have many people come to the topic, but it was out there. And I talked about the Holocaust. I wrote an article about the Holocaust in the countries of the Middle East. That stuff also is all out there. Tomorrow night, there's something from the association of, what is it called? The American Sephardi Association. On Tuesday of next week or Wednesday of next week, there's another thing coming from the American Jewish University also about this topic. It's out there. Just we don't talk about it all that much. But the stuff is out there, and there are people who are involved in it.
So I do have a follow-up question, and then you have a question too? Great. It's a very hard question. We do talk about Middle Eastern Jews versus European Jews, but really, as you were saying too, European Jews have the Jewish gene. And up until the 60s, Jews, even in America, were not considered European Jews, were not considered white in America, right? So, of course, there was an incentive to kind of assimilate into the privileged side of things. But do you think that now that Jews have succeeded assimilating into this side, they would be willing to say we're actually not white? I told you it's a hard question.
I came of age academically at a time in which the government of the United States created 4 tracked categories for the Equal Opportunity Committee. I went to the law school and I pulled out the legislation. Legislation is very unambiguous. The employers need to track the employment for equal opportunity, but your identity for those 4 track, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. The 5 track categories are everybody else. We call them Caucasian, but if you read the documentation, Middle East, various other places that were not Asian and Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, Black African Americans, and Native Americans. Those were the 4 track categories. That was totally up to you. So according to the statute, the regulation rather, you could decide that you were a Spanish speaker, and that's what you could check off because that's what the regulation said. That's not how it came to be. Prior to that time, there wasn't this concept, but there was a very famous study by Will Herberg, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. Back in those days, those were the 3 categories, not Christian, Jew, and Muslim. Protestant, Catholic, Jew had a number of interesting things. First of all, Blacks were largely, African Americans were largely Protestant. They did not fit into his typology. So despite the threefold title, there were actually 4 categories. African-American Protestants were also included. But that's how people were considered. They were Protestant, Catholic, or Jew, not white or black or Hispanic American. So this was all created for equal employment. Equal employment is a very good thing, but it seems to me that people have internalized this as having ethnic identity as being the most important marker. I don't think if you went back to the 1950s and 60s, you would see the same type of thing. Some of the people in this room may remember those days. I don't think we thought about, I mean, yeah, in New Rochelle, New York, there were the African Americans and there were the Jews, but there were also the Irish Italian Catholics, and this word that we don't use anymore, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Those were the 4 categories, not white privilege versus anybody else. And so this is something which did happen over my lifetime, to bear in mind.
That it became more,
Well, that we talked
ethnicity
about white
into-
privilege in ways that we did not.
it
Years ago.
morphed more from
Yeah.
ethnicity into social structure or construct.
The Jews of my parents' generation and the grandparents of some of the people in this room basically bought into cultural erasure as well as cultural preservation. What do I mean? You are going to public school. You're going to learn English and you're going to get into Yale and Harvard. And you're going to go to Hebrew school, which may or may not have been very successful, but that's how they balanced it. And that was the answer all those years ago.
Thank you. So in short, your answer is no. Debbie, did you want to have a question? Oh, here, go ahead.
I converted to Judaism, so I don't have a lot of deep understanding of certain things. But when you mentioned from the river to the sea, I know that was very controversial. And, my daughter, who is a Columbia student, would talk about, the chanting that she would hear out here on the campuses. And when you mentioned it, I thought it was fascinating. And I wish you would go a little more deeply into your findings and talk a little bit more about that and why it's so emotional among everyone.
So I talked about from the river to the sea because Rabbi Gadi said over and over again, the people at Columbia don't even know which river and which sea. You say from the river to the sea. Okay, which river is that? And which sea is that? And I argued something very similar to what Benjamin said, which is from the river to the sea is a creation of the British Colonial Office. People who think about this as being from time immemorial, to quote the title of a very important book about immigration by Arabs, it was mentioned in the film, immigration by people whose descendants today identify as Arabs from all different sorts of countries around the world. People who talk about from the river to the sea and Palestine is an age-old concept are talking about, first of all, a name that was created not by colonialists, but by the original imperatori, the original imperialists, the Romans. Hadrian created the title Syro-Palestina in about 135 Christian era, CE, common era. And when there were provinces of Palestine prior to the British colonial era, they were all not from, the river was not the boundary, or not the entire boundary. Another thing that is colonial, thank you very much. My Arab students hated when I mentioned Sykes-Picot, but the Palestinians adopted Sykes' flag. They changed the order of two of the bars, but it is a British colonial flag which they adopted. So that's part of what I did, what I mentioned, and that's why I mentioned we should know what the river to the sea mentioned. Now, this is not to cast aspersions on the hopes of Arabs living in the area that is now the state of Israel or governed by the state of Israel as a military government, or not governed by the state of Israel because Hamas rules there. This is not to cast aspersions on the national heritage that those Arabs would like to see emerge, but it is to cast aspersion on the idea of its antiquity and the idea that this anything other than a colonial creation, just as much as Israel might be in their eyes.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth just defining for the folks here and online the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And
Oh, right.
there are basically, I think we can say, three very important documents or sets of documents that that colonial Britain was involved with in the carving out of the land that is now Israel and Palestine, and other territories as well. Those are the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is a British-French agreement over what should happen to the entire region, the carving up and separating out of the various countries, which have shifted borders since then. But basically, those countries and a lot of the state collapse that we've seen in the last couple of decades can be attributed to this agreement, which might be why you might have heard of it because it was in the news for a minute. But that was one agreement. And there was also the Balfour Declaration, which I think we mentioned, in which the British colonial government promised to the Zionist movement a Jewish homeland in Palestine without specifying over Palestine or anything like that, very intentionally worded. And there was the Hussein McMahon correspondence, in which the British colonial regime negotiated with Arab nationalist leaders, the Hashemites of today, over the region, and promised them territories which were worded in order to suggest a little bit vaguely, but in order to suggest to the Hashemites that Palestine would also be part of their domain. So it's important to understand that these are colonial boundaries. There's no authenticity to them or anything like that. And the kinds of divide and rule politics that they were playing when they carved Lebanon out from Syria in order to have a territory in which Christians could have enough power, is the same kind of divide and rule politics, the same playing off of each other they were doing when they vaguely, without really certainly, promised the same lands to the Arab nationalist movement and to the Zionist movement. And this kind of colonial double dealing and divide and rule is how we get to the conflicts of today.
Mm-hmm. And the League of Nations, this is part of that agreement of the League of Nations?
Well, the League of Nations allocated to the colonial powers the mandates. They transitioned the officially colonial structure into the mandatory structure, which was essentially the same thing. You can even see British colonial officials sometimes mixing them up in their private writings when they don't have to be careful in public about distinguishing one from the other, because it's really the same thing.
Which is interesting that America did not go into.
Yes, I don't know if you can speak more to this.
But
Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, proposed the idea of the League of Nations, but Congress 100 years ago was very isolationist and never approved it. And we'll see what happens going forward with isolationism.
Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that Benjamin is actually a very fascinating statement, which I like an awful lot, about how you have to blame the British for their colonial, I don't really want to say ineptness. They are sharp colonialist ideas about how to divide and conquer. The British can easily have argued, or we could argue today, that the Hashemites did not rule in Saudi Arabia because the Saudis kicked them out. And I suspect that King Faisal, a Hashemite king, might have been convinced by the British to have the national home for Jews in Palestine as part of a Jordanian, what today we would call a Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. That's not what happened. Winston Churchill drew the famous green crayon on the Jordan River and separated it out and never tried to give this to the Hashemites. I don't know that Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, would have been very happy without a sovereign state of Israel. But the history of how the state of Israel evolved is that typically the Jews said, well, I'm not happy with the 1937 partition proposal, but let's go with it because that's what we have. I'm not happy with a Jewish national home, which is not, Herzl was prepared to have a non-sovereign state in the land of Israel.
Yeah.
He was happy to have a non-sovereign state in what he called Uganda, Kenya today. So that I suspect that had the British said, this is how it's going to be, it would have worked. Had the British told the brother of Haj Amin al-Husseini, I'm sorry, had the brother of Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was accepting of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, had they told his brother after he died, Haj Amin, no, you can't do this, things might have been very different. Haj Amin said, kill the Jews. The British could easily have clamped down on him, but didn't.
And
Thank you,
they
thank you.
appointed him to his position too.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much. So we did start a little bit after 7, but we do need to then end a little bit after 9. So I would like to just take a last quick question from the audience, from from online, really. And the question is, how can we change historian to think different and give credit to all ethnic Jewish?
Events
Yeah.
like this.
Event like this. Okay, I think this is a great end to this, and I just want to thank of course, my colleagues, Dr. Seth Ward, and when I said to Dr. Seth Ward when he came to our congregation to speak, I actually met Dr. Ward at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, when I was looking for an academic advisor to continue my research about Jews from Arab countries, which I realized also when my classmates didn't know much about the Jews from Arab countries. What shocked me even more is that I realized that I don't know much about it. And this started my research. So thank you. And I said to him, I look forward for your visit. And if you return, it will be a reward. So excuse me for my puns, but it's part of being a rabbi. They train us that way. I also really want to thank also Dr. Berman-Gladstone Berman, that he was introduced to me after I left here. He came here, he did his PhD about the Jews of Yemen at NYU, and he started his postdoctoral this year, so I wasn't here anymore, but I was introduced to him by an organization that sponsored both. He is a fellow, a research fellow at an organization called Boi Teman, and it's under the umbrella of the organization of Leba Tamar in Israel, and they sponsored our day of interviews in Israel. We have many more interviews. My parents we extracted it because we just didn't have time in 30 minutes to cover everybody. So we are now both research fellows in the same organization. We were supposed to be in Israel next week to present, but El Al tickets are now $6,000. So we will be presenting online. But it was a pleasure knowing you and for you to be part of this, and I'm sure we'll go forward with that. I want to thank Dr. Reverend Ian Rottenberg, who is the Dean of the Columbia Religious Life, that is our host here. And of course, thank you very much. I want to thank, to produce an evening like this and the film. I'm sure you can understand how much effort and amazing people behind the scenes. And I would just want to mention a few of them. Alex Appel, she's a reporter for the Connecticut Inside Investigator, and she's a member of my congregation. And she came to Israel on her account to be part of the interviews and the day that was sponsored by Leba Tamar. Her husband, Dylan Simard, who also worked for PBS in the past, and they were the dubbing voices of my parents. Very, very talented, and we wouldn't be able to pull this off without them. Their family friend, Shayna Bethune, she has the media. She's a TV producer, Shave Media in Boston, and she was the editor of the film that you saw. We kept sending her material and interviews. And she did a fantastic job. Yaniv Roca, who is a director that we're planning to take this now and add it to a feature film that will go to festivals. And he did Queen Mimi in the past, who won awards with Zach Galifianakis. And a friend of ours, we have a mutual friend who introduced us, and that was great. Michelle Miller, actress and executive producer and host of Mentors on the Mic. She is also, of course, my cousin, and she really helped me articulate some of my messages last year and this year. Of course, my colleagues at Project Genesis Interfaith, Father Roy Tverdik, who is here with us today, and Dr. Don Russo, who's online, who really were behind this project. Of course, my family, who worked tirelessly to produce the material and come to the interviews. And finally, Dr. Rachel Yadid, who is the director of Eleba Tamar in Israel, and she'll continue to work with us on developing curriculum. Our goal is to really have maybe even a chair in universities, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Columbia, that would be a chair of Jewish Middle Eastern studies that could also link to interfaith work that I think go hand in hand. And Professor Aaron Gimani from Bar Ilan University, who contributed a lot of the knowledge that we shared this evening. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to have many more years of these events. And of course, everybody online, thank you very much for taking this time.